Okay, I'm Meredith Blackwell, and I am here to talk with Don Pfister and we're going to interview Andy Wilson, and we're doing this for this project called the Oral History for Mycology. We're at the annual Mycological Society of America meeting. We're in a hotel at the edge of the University of Florida campus, and today is the 11th of July, 2022. So, Don.
I'm Don Pfister. We're here with Andrew Wilson, and what we do is start people just talking about their early life, where they were born, where they're from, and
Something about their families,
families, and then your first encounters with fungi.
So I grew up in the Central Valley of California, Stanislaus County, and Modesto, California. Actually, my first formative years were in Escalon, which is a small town just north of Modesto. And growing up in that part of the country was fantastic because you're nestled in between the Sierra Nevada. A couple hours east is Yosemite Valley, and beautiful part of the country to visit nature and visit the forests. In the other opposite direction was the Bay Area of Northern California. So I remember as a high school student going to visit in Berkeley, California, and hang out in record shops up there. But growing up there was great, and both my parents were kind of academics in a way. My mother actually taught elementary school. Third grade was her primary age group that she taught at. And my dad taught at Modesto Junior College. Back in the 70s, during the Carter administration, he was very into alternative energy type science and communication. So he traveled around the country and he brought the family there, and we visited wind farms and looked at solar power and solar energy. And I remember having little fairs where there'd be this little solar oven that was just basically a box with a piece of glass or plywood on it that he would cook hot dogs inside of it, just using the power of the sun.
Egg on sidewalk.
Egg on sidewalk kind of things. And that was kind of fun, just like being curious about nature and the world in general and how things work. And these were interesting career paths for both my parents. Both my parents were actually biology majors. They both went to Chico State in California, and my dad got his master's degree in biology, but he predominantly focused on vertebrates. Specifically, his master's degree was on squirrels.
But neither one had a mycology course.
Neither one of them really took mycology.
Because there was a mycologist there.
At Chico?
At Chico. I thought, maybe not. Go ahead.
Then neither of them influenced my parents to any significant degree. But I think I got a lot of my interest and curiosity in science from both of them to an extent. Now, I mean, my dad's direction was a little bit more typical and looking at vertebrates, looking at pretty much charismatic organisms like squirrels. My mom was much more curious about the obscure organisms. First of all, one of her spirit animals is an owl, but I'd say her second, or if not primary spirit animals, would be frogs and spiders. So she was very interested in the creepy crawlies, the curious organisms that she kind of found in her own unique way cute and adorable. So I think for that aspect, the more curious organisms in nature, I get that from my mom. And it took a while, however, for me to actually find science as my primary direction. In high school, I did marching band. I found myself percussion. I was largely into drums. And I also did other aspects of the arts and humanities. I was very into a jewelry making and airbrush. I actually won an airbrush competition in high school. It was like a national one, or I didn't win it. I was like third place.
Okay,
Um,
that's pretty good.
it's still pretty good for national airbrush competition, where they were giving awards out for the kinds of airbrush you would see on the side of vans or on the hoods of cars. And mine was actually a little bit different. It was more politically motivated. It actually illustrated the problems with poverty and government. But anyway, it was definitely out there. And when I was looking at college and universities, I went to the local community college, Modesto Junior College. And I remember going to a local party in the neighborhood, like some neighbors were getting together, and one of the older neighbors was asking me what my major was going to be. And I said I had no idea. I did not know what I was going to study. But he asked then what I was interested in during my high school years. And I explained, marching band, all these other arts related things. And then he just blurted out, maybe you should look into the humanities. And I didn't really know what that meant, what the humanities were. I just started looking at universities that offered a humanities degree. And there were 2 universities within California, both California State University schools. One was CSU Dominguez Hills, which is in the Los Angeles area. And if you're from Northern California, you tend to think anything Southern California is kind of gross. I'm a little bit biased that way. So I wanted to stay in Northern California, and of course the other campus that offered a humanities degree was San Francisco State University. And you could probably see where this might be going. I enrolled at San Francisco State University, started my humanities degree there, was taking great courses. And to take the humanities where you're studying the arts, art history, theory of art, San Francisco is a beautiful and great city to be in. But after about a year and a half and taking these awesome courses, I began to wonder what my job prospects were. And prior to starting at San Francisco State University, I did go with my father on a 2-week ecotourism trip to Costa Rica. And that influenced me because I had a lot of fun on that trip with my dad. And I realized that there was a lot of adventure in nature that I wanted to take advantage of. And so I decided I was going to swap over to biology, not knowing much about biology at San Francisco State, but started taking courses in biology and started having a lot of fun there. And that story got complicated my second semester of taking introductory biology because of unstable housing situations. I did bad on, I think, one of my exams. And that happened to be the exam that covered fungi during introductory biology. So about a year later, when I had to take a genetics, the professor that was teaching genetics was on sabbatical. And I knew I wanted to take genetics from this particular professor. So I decided to drop that course in my schedule. And I was like going, well, what could I fill in this hole? And I was looking through the course catalog and I saw, oh, biology of the fungi. I've heard good things about this Dennis Desjardins person. And I know I wanted to make up for that deficiency from introductory biology. So I started taking Dennis's course. And I was stuck. From that moment on, I was completely enchanted, largely because Dennis communicated the amazing nature of fungi and the biology of the fungi in such a fascinating way, but it was taking it in California with such a rich diversity of mushrooms and fungi. And it also really helped that, he had some great projects too. So that's kind of how I grew up in California and found myself studying fungi.
Did you get a master's with him, or did?
Yeah, I as an undergraduate, I was taking courses. I took biology of the fungi, and then the following year, he took a course that was specifically called the higher fungi, but essentially macrofungi, learning all about mushrooms and mushroom diversity. And I think at that point, he was wrapping up his grant on the mushrooms of the Hawaiian Islands. And Chris Peterson was a graduate student with him before she left to go study with you. And Brian Perry as well was wrapping up.
Who came and studied with me.
Came and studied with you. So there's a long legacy there. And then I sort of did that, followed suit later on, but that's later on in the story. I think around the same time that Hawaiian Islands grant was ending, he had just received a new grant to study the macrofungal diversity of the Indonesian islands of Java and Bali. This was largely to follow E.J.H. Corner's work and research that he had done back in the day, and really just follow up to fill in the gaps of what he's done and how it translates to what we know now. And so it was a 4-year grant, and he had two graduate students that were starting right when I was taking the higher fungi course, and that was Kelly Collins and Atik Retnawati. And so when I was taking his class, I was kind of doing the math that a master's degree takes about 2 years, and he's got 2 graduate students during the first 2 years of a 4-year grant. So I was like, do you have anybody for these last 2 years, Dennis? And I think I just sort of like finagled my way into being his incoming graduate student on this grant project. So the timing was a bit off. I was actually about to finish within a year or year and a half before he could take me on as a new graduate student. So what I ended up doing is I finished with my master's in both biology and humanities, or actually, no, I'm sorry, my BA in biology of all things, and a BA in, or maybe it was a BS. I need to go back and look at my degrees. I think it was a BA in humanities and a BS in biology from San Francisco State. And then I had a semester off where I worked in the biology stockroom at San Francisco State. And many of the years, or the summers especially, as an undergraduate at San Francisco State, I had spent at the Sierra Nevada field campus, which is
where Dennis taught the course.
Where he taught the spring fungi course. And there are many other courses taught there, but I got a job working for Jim Steele, who was the station director, helping gather data and doing a census of migratory songbirds. So I did a lot of mist netting and bird banding of Sierra Nevada birds during at least 2 summers when I was an undergraduate. I took that experience and I leveraged it into an opportunity to be a researcher in Costa Rica again. So between getting my bachelor's degree and starting my master's, I spent about 4 months in Costa Rica doing migratory bird surveys of Costa Rican birds. And I then turned around, and the gentleman who was our tour guide when my dad and I went to Costa Rica did sea turtle conservation. And I reached out to him and I told him I would like to do sea turtle conservation work as well. So I spent about a month and a half living on a beach in Costa Rica, monitoring sea turtles and their nests. And so that was a great biology experience. The next thing I did is I came back to the US, and within a month of returning, I was in Indonesia picking mushrooms.
With Dennis. Okay.
Yeah. And that was a great experience too, because that's where I met Roy Holling and Egon Horak. And from that experience, I had a crash course in mushroom taxonomy, studying LBMs, little brown mushrooms in the genus Gymnopus.
So then did you go to work on a PhD right away?
It took about a couple years of working on these mushrooms and doing this taxonomy and systematic work. And this was kind of somewhat in the later end of the early days of mushroom systematics. This was right after Jean-Marc Moncalvo's big seminal Agaricales work, where they looked at the large subunit of the Agaricales.
Lots of them.
Lots of them. And I borrowed some of that data and added a little bit of my own to do a systematic study, which is, I think, my most cited first author paper that I have out currently. And I think it wasn't until about the IMA in Oslo that I was ready to move to Clark University to work with David Hibbett. I think I started around 1999 in my master's degree, and it took about 2002 before I started in David Hibbett's lab.
And then you finished up, and I know I ran into you in Kathy Ames' lab, but that was after you'd been at Chicago?
Yeah, I did my PhD with David. I finished that in 2009, and I think it was probably around 2008, 2007, I was still looking for postdoctoral positions and opportunities. I'd applied for a few. Some few of them weren't quite a good fit, or I was a little bit late to apply. But then it was at the Penn State meetings at the MSA where I step out of the hotel and there's Roy Halling. And Roy's going, "You need to talk to Greg Mueller." And I knew who Greg was because he had worked with Roy on Costa Rican macrofungi. And I thought, oh, why? He's like, oh, because Greg's has a postdoc position open and he's looking for somebody. So I thought, great, I will love to talk to Greg. The next thing I know, I'm sitting down for a talk and I get a tap on a shoulder and I turn around and there's Greg Mueller. He's like going, "Hey, I just talked to Roy. You interested in a postdoc?" And that's kind of was it. At that time, Greg Mueller was finishing up his position. I wouldn't say finishing up. He was making the transition from being curator of mycology at the Field Museum to being the vice president of sciences and academic affairs at the Chicago Botanic Garden. And he was finishing up a grant on the genus Lacaria. Kentaro Hosaka was the previous postdoctoral researcher on that grant. And Kentaro had just got a position at the National Museum in Japan. And so he had to leave early or before the grant was over. And so I stepped in to fill Kentaro's shoes. And fortunately, it led to an opportunity to be at the gardens in the Midwest for many, many years. That, after a while, turned into a part-time position, which I supplemented with teaching in the Chicago area. It involved teaching at a local junior college, Wilbur Wright City College. And then I also had a position at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, which was essentially teaching science. I taught a mycology course and a botany course there. And I think in the meetings somewhere around that time, I can't remember which meetings they were exactly, but I talked to Kathy, I ran into Kathy, and she said that she was leaving LSU because Purdue gave her an offer that was too good to refuse. And I thought, oh, great. Would you happen to need a postdoc? And so I think I nudged her just forcefully enough to convince her to give me an opportunity to work with her at Purdue. That lasted for a year, but it was a great year for me because I got to meet and work with great people in her lab because she fosters a great community. And then we put together a paper that I'm quite proud of because it involved being very creative with working with both fungal phylogenies and plant phylogenies in looking at how you can use reconciliation analyses in phylogenetics to test hypotheses or evolutionary hypotheses in fungal evolution. And to this day, it's kind of one of my favorite papers because it involves so much creative research.
Let me ask you something about the time with Kathy. Had you ever looked at rust fungi?
I had not taken rust fungi seriously.
Had your father?
My father? Oh, yeah. So you probably heard.
I tried to. We need to talk to him, or Kathy does. We could not find the fungi he found for her.
Oh, yeah.
So tell us about that.
So my dad is adorable in a lot of ways because he kind of lives vicariously, his scientific interests, he lives vicariously through me in a lot of ways. He still practices in some aspects, but a lot of what I'm do, he tends to follow closely. And so when I joined Kathy's lab, I learned about lots of different fungi, and I'm going to mess up the name, so Kathy's going to see this and be mad at me, but there was a basal lineage of rust fungi that grows on Torreya californica. And Roger, do you know the name of the genus? Kathy changed the genus, but it's...
I don't remember. I've heard it a number of times.
Anyway, we'll move on. But I understood that there's the last few remaining stands of these tree species tend to grow in California, especially in the Sierra Nevada, which my parents happened to retire to. It's a part of the country that they lived in. And I asked my dad, who was at the time part of the California Native Plant Society, if he knew where these stands were, and if he could be troubled to look for these little white rusts that occur along the leaf veins of these Torreya leaves. And he goes, sure. And the next thing, his next visit to the Midwest to visit me, he brought these specimens to Kathy's lab, or he took pictures and he showed them to me, and then Kathy was like, oh my gosh. And so he brought a bunch of these, and they turned out to be exactly what they were looking for. But I think since then, they haven't been able to find it.
The sequel is that I went out with Kathy, and I was not looking for rust fungi, but I went on this trip, and it was up at fairly high elevations. We couldn't find it anywhere. Yeah. We found where probably your father had parked, and there was a mile marker nearby, but we never found it. And there was another known locality on a mountain or a high hill near San Quentin. And so went out there with Tom Bruns, and they found some, but it was immature, or it was over mature. It had been the last year's production, I think. Okay. So she never was able to find it. So we think we're going to have to rely on your father again. It's not my project, it's Kathy.
Right.
So tell him to get ready.
Yeah, I think every year I talk to my dad about it. The challenge is that I think some of these last remaining stands do tend to be on private property. And so, they're in an area that was burned 2 years ago. I think the fire was 2 years ago. But they're up a very steep hill, road cut, and they're sort of hard to get to, and they're kind of spaced out. Yeah. But I thought it was really interesting that your father was the better collector.
Well, he was there at the right time for the right fungus and so forth.
Yeah, and he was interested in the plants. He knew what the plants were. And there are other plants, other gymnosperms there that are hard to distinguish from the road drive along. That probably helped. So then, how'd you get to Denver?
Dumb luck, I would say. I was very fortunate. I mean, I had been as a postdoc for quite a number of years. kind of always the bridesmaid, never the bride sort of situation where, you know, I'd gone through a number of interviews, but wasn't the one that was chosen. And I was just very fortunate because one year there's this position for a curator of mycology comes up from Denver Botanic Gardens. And I wasn't quite familiar with the Denver Botanic Gardens as a fungarium, as an institution. And I asked Craig about it, and he goes, "Oh yeah, you know, Vera Evenson and Sam Mitchell and blah, blah, blah. They have a good history going back a number of years." And I go, "Okay, I'm very curious about this." So I submitted my application, and it took a while, and I wasn't hearing anything. And at some point I asked around, and I think it was as soon as I asked around, and then I think this might be an important message. If you don't really hear anything, it's important to just follow up, because I think in the process of following up with them, they all of a sudden noticed me, or maybe my application stood out a bit more, because then next thing I know, I'm being called out for an interview. And so I got an interview. And one of the things that I learned from that interview was that I impressed them not necessarily just because of my science, but that I showed up with a tie. I was taken seriously because I acted like I wanted to be taken seriously. And I sort of learned in a number of ways that if you show up not dressed like you're serious about the position, that the people don't think you're that serious.
Yeah.
So I learned that from Chicago Botanic Garden, because there was a couple candidates that came through that weren't dressed the part.
It's always good to wear a tie.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and do you like your job? You did get it.
I think it's probably the best place I could have ended up at. It's been fantastic so far. It's a small position relatively, and it doesn't have a lot of the benefits of academia, but also it doesn't have a lot of the hang-ups of academia. We're a small enough department to where we kind of can write our own rules in some way, or we can develop them as we go along because we're just figuring them out. We're kind of young in that way. But we're also, being a smaller institution, being part of the museum-based world, the compensation is a little bit lower financially, but I think you are paid back in terms of your academic freedom and your ability to sort of like pave your own way. It's been interesting to just working on developing as an academic side of our institution. I think this last year was my first participation in a collaborative NSF proposal. And as a PI on that proposal, I'm the first one in my institution to be given that award.
Wow.
So our institution wasn't recognized by NSF, so we had to go through that whole process of becoming an
certification and so forth.
So you show up when you scroll.
Yeah. So that worked out pretty well.
Well, that's good that it got on.
Yeah, and so now we don't have to do that anymore. NSF will recognize us.
Yeah, good. Well, I think we're running down on time a little bit here, but it's great to have kind of heard the background. I think it's interesting. We see people who have had no family support, first to go to college and so forth, and yours is a kind of different story. We're hearing that there was a family support and a family connection that doesn't always happen.
I love the story about your dad.
Yeah.
Kathy kept saying, "Where did he park?
Yeah.
Where did he climb up that road cut?"
No, but this was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very nice.